The Waddesdon Bequest is one of the great collections of Renaissance works of virtuosity. The objects were first put together in the great Rothschild house in Buckinghamshire, Waddesdon Manor. And when Baron Ferdinand wanted to give them to the British Museum so that they could be enjoyed by everybody, he wanted that connection with Waddesdon to remain. And so we've always called it since then the Waddesdon Bequest.
We all think, because of Downton Abbey, that, you know, country houses were places that you went to kind of hunt and shoot and kiss. But actually, country houses at that time, certainly for the Rothschilds, had a much more serious purpose. They were places to entertain the great and the good, and they were places to show off, really, your wealth and your success and that you had arrived. And there were these tremendous house parties, and you'll get Queen Victoria, you'll get Edward VII, you'll get Trollope, you'll get Henry James, you'll get the Shah of Persia. And the people you won't necessarily notice are probably the more important people, the people who did the business deals, the movers and shakers. That was really, you know, what the country house party, certainly for Ferdinand, was about. So Waddesdon was quite literally a 3D calling card.
I think Baron Ferdinand enjoyed dressing up, and we have these wonderful photographs of him in Renaissance costume for costume balls, which show him looking quite ridiculous in Renaissance costume as a Renaissance prince, wearing hat badges very like the ones in the Waddesdon Bequest, or holding a jewelled dagger very like the one in the Waddesdon Bequest, which is very much part and parcel of his own time. If you think of Oscar Wilde's novel The Portrait of Dorian Gray, he portrays Dorian Gray as someone who loves emeralds and loves dressing up and wearing Renaissance princely costume. Well, it's just the same with Ferdinand. So I think there's a definite theatrical dressing up element in Ferdinand's collection, which probably goes very well with Waddesdon Manor.
This is the famous Red Book, which is the privately printed photograph album which records the manor and the interiors and some of the key works in the collection, and which is this wonderful document which shows the treasures from the Waddesdon Bequest in situ in the house, in the smoking room. So here, as we open it up, we can see that there are images both of the outside of the house, and then we move into the inside and we work through the ground floor first of all, before heading upstairs to the smoking room.
The smoking room was a place that Ferdinand would take his male guests after dinner. And it was very important that it was a place of kind of shock and awe. Because, of course, as you know, deals were started in the boardroom, but they ended in the ballroom via the smoking room.
The smoking room has a very distinct personality. Elsewhere in the house, you could be forgiven for thinking that you're in an 18th century Parisian hotel, whereas in the smoking room, you're in a very different world. And I think that Ferdinand was setting the scene here in a very particular way for his Renaissance museum.
He was surrounded by Rothschilds, all of whom, as soon as they'd made some money, started to collect rather aggressively. I believe in genes, don't you? The Rothschild genes clearly have a sort of mania for collecting. It was partly his father's collection, which he inherited.
I think when Anselm Rothschild saw the Holy Thorn reliquary, he knew that this was not just one of the great moments of medieval metalwork. It was also one of the most precious things he was ever likely to be able to acquire, and extraordinarily rare. The thorn, said to be from the crown of thorns put on Christ's head at the crucifixion, is surrounded by the most valuable materials: rock crystal, jewels, gold, enamel, so that you have the most spiritually precious object surrounded by the most materially valuable things. And I think that combination of very high quality, very rich materials, and ultimate rarity, well, that's irresistible to any collector.
For Ferdinand, collecting was really very genuinely part of his DNA. We know that from a very early age, he was fascinated by collections and collecting. And I have this vision of him following his father, Anselm, around, sort of learning, at his father's knee almost. In his reminiscences, he records his first exposure to his father's collection. My father's curiosities were packed and stored away in a strong room, where they remained until the cold
drove us back again from the country. It was my privilege on these occasions to place some of the smaller articles in their own leather cases. Merely to touch them sent a thrill of delight through my small frame.
So this is one of the most spectacular objects in the Woodson Bequest, and it's also one of my favourites. It's a boxwood tabernacle, and it's incredibly sculptural and architectural, as you can see in its form. It's like a miniature building. And all the pieces come apart so that you can play with them. So it's got a very strong, playful quality. Playing with those pieces, each time you reveal new scenes from the Christian story. You take off the pelican and her piety finial, and these sections open out like orange segments, and on the inside each is carved with yet another scene. And in the middle is the Virgin Mary, who rises up when you turn this little ratchet. So it's really an interactive toy for taking you closer to the Christian story. Perhaps the most intricate piece of all is this, which is a prayer nut, or Betnuss in German. The outside is carved with these extraordinary pieces of Gothic tracery, and you can imagine yourself walking around this architectural form of the prayer nut. It's a bit like some astonishing Gothic cathedral. And when you open it up, there are yet two more doors which are carved with scenes from the life of Christ. And when you open those, the top half is carved with the scene of the crucifixion in incredible detail. It's like a miniature theatre. I always find it an incredibly moving thing to handle. It's a very personal, intimate kind of object. And then the craftsmanship is so astonishing that every time you look at it, you notice something different, and it really comes to life in your hands. You can imagine the person who first owned this object playing with it and handling it. And I'm sure that's what Baron Ferdinand did when he showed it to his visitors in the smoking room.
You have to remind yourself that, his wife had died in childbirth, and that really was a dominating and depressing factor throughout his life. And he wrote this rather sad piece: "Mine is a loss which years cannot repair, nor any accidental circumstances relieve. Ever since my childhood, I was attached to her. The older I became, the more we met, the deeper I loved her, and in later years she'd so grown into my heart that my only wishes, cares, joys, affections, whatever sentiments in fact a man can possess, were directly or indirectly wound up with her existence." A sad piece. He found human relationships, I think, difficult. He liked inviting people here, but they weren't really close friends. And the one absorbing passion in his life was this property. And he wanted to create, both on the inside and the outside, something which was coherent and remarkable.
He really loved the idea of walking into a room and being surrounded by European culture, European history.
It wasn't just that they were showing off. You have to remember that only 100 years before, they'd lived in a ghetto in Frankfurt where they hadn't had enough food.
If you are a Jewish family in the mid-19th century, you're trying to establish yourself. So you collect in order to tell the people around you that you're not going anywhere. This is theatre. It's 15th century performance. What you've got is you've got every single kind of movement going on here. You've got coiling, You've got dripping, you've got this incredible, powerful kind of transitive pushing, and kind of thrusting of these great kind of sticky gobstopper blues and reds actually into the glass. It's an object for the Kunstkammer, for the Wunderkammer, for these spaces which are just filled with treasures.
The Kunstkammer means an art chamber or an art room. They're formed by merchant bankers like the Medici or the Fugger, the merchant banking dynasties of the Renaissance. They're also formed by the Habsburgs, who were the ruling dynasty of half the then known world in the 16th century.
It's a Renaissance idea made real by a 19th century banker.
The Rothschilds, in a way, were tying themselves by provenance to former movers and shakers, and they used these objects very deliberately to make that association.
In creating kind of a Rothschild Kunstkammer, he's saying very clearly, this is who we are, this is what I'm doing, I'm looking back to these precedents, and I'm making a collection of that type.
This, the light jewel, I suppose it's just resonant because it's this sort of famous, incredibly valuable, historic object that is, and it's when you pick it up, its density is not just physical, but it's sort of emotional and historical as well. And just the sheer number of man-hours in something like this just seems to exist. I think we all have a physical sense of that when we see things in a museum, and I think the Waddesdon Bequest is probably particularly full of them, of these objects that are imbued with enormous amounts of time and care, and that radiates out of them. They're to show the power of the owner, because that you are buying man-hours here. You are buying not only expensive, luxury, rare materials, but you are buying the man-hours of the best technicians of the day. For me, as a maker looking at it, it's not only incredibly bedazzling, but it's also mind-bogglingly precise in an age before all the high-tech wonders of our age. For it to end up back in a public collection in our sort of great museum of record is a wonderful thing.
Ferdinand died very unexpectedly in 1898, and it then became clear that he had taken the decision to bequeath this collection that he called his Renaissance Museum to the British Museum, and his will is very specific about that fact. He talks about the contents of my new smoking room at the manor, and that was what he intended to go to the museum, his cabinet of curiosities.
He was always public-spirited. I mean, very early on in his life, he wrote about the kind of transfer from princely collections to museums and how he thought this was a good thing.
It's the only collection within the British Museum that must be shown together on its own. And that gives it, of course, a very particular quality. You are with the collector while you are in his collection.
We're standing in what's called the middle room in the British Museum, which has now been transformed into the new gallery for the Waddesdon Bequest. It's a wonderful new space because it's calm, it still has the feel of a library. This was Charles Dickens's library in the old British Museum in the 1830s. Working with the designer Stanton Williams, we've done many, many groupings of the objects until we found groupings which seemed to us to make sense and make the collection more intelligible as a family Rothschild collection.
The wonderful thing about the bequest as now shown is that it allows visitors to have almost the same intimacy of engagement with the objects as Ferdinand had. And I think you feel through that the intensity of his affection and the emotion that went into the making and the collecting.
Because of technology and advances in lighting, you can probably show Wunderkammer objects to better effect than ever before.
In these very transparent cases, the objects feel so close and seem so close that you could reach out and touch them. And the aim is to be very close to the smoking room experience in which Baron Ferdinand would have been your guide.
I'm kind of amazed. It's really impressive. I wouldn't expect to find that in the British Museum.
Waddesdon Gallery is probably my favorite, just because everything is so intricate and detailed. And really the whole thing, I could spend hours in here just walking around and enjoying it.
The reality is that the more time you take, the more beautiful and extraordinary and actually very moving it becomes as an experience. So it's a very simple thing, but slow down. Just slow down.
I love seeing all the different things. Like when you look at these artifacts, you're like, this is real life. Like this isn't like a show. This isn't like something a machine made. This is something that people actually made, and so you get a real understanding of it.
In the digital age, the thing is still the thing, and you can make pilgrimage and be in its presence and see it sparkles in your eye and not in the camera's eye, and that is something precious.